The gray November sky over Edwards Air Force Base stretched endlessly as Captain Sarah Chen watched the B-2 Spirit emerge from its climate-controlled hangar. The stealth bomber's angular wings caught the desert light like some prehistoric bird of prey. Its surface is so precisely engineered that radar signals simply slid off into nothingness. In 6 hours, Sarah would either make aviation history or become another cautionary tale about pilots who reach too far beyond their capabilities. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The betting pool in the pilot's lounge had already reached $12,000, and not a single vote had been cast in her favor. Captain Sarah Chen had always been different, though she'd spent most of her military career trying to hide that fact. Standing 5 feet 4 inches in her flight boots, she possessed an almost supernatural ability to feel an aircraft's moods through her fingertips, reading vibrations and shifts that other pilots missed entirely. Her instructors at the Air Force Academy had called it intuitive flying, but her peers had less charitable terms. They said she overthought everything, that she flew like she was afraid to trust the instruments, always second-guessing the computer systems that modern warfare demanded pilots embrace without question. The call to Edwards had come on a Tuesday morning while Sarah was reviewing maintenance reports for her F-35 squadron at Shaw Air Force Base. Colonel Marcus Webb's voice carried the kind of authority that made seasoned pilots straighten their spines even over a secure phone line. "Chen, you've been selected for the B-2 Advanced Capabilities Program. Report to Edwards next Monday for evaluation." Sarah had nearly dropped the phone. The B-2 program was legendary within the Air Force, shrouded in classification levels that required special clearances just to acknowledge its existence. Only the absolute elite flew the Spirit. Pilots with thousands of hours in heavy aircraft and combat records that read like fiction novels. Sarah had neither. Her logbook showed competence in fighters, not the strategic bombers that required different skills entirely. "Sir, I think there might be some mistake. I don't have heavy aircraft experience." Webb's laugh held no humor. "No mistake, Captain. Your psychological profile indicates certain traits we're looking for. Pack for an extended stay." The line went dead, leaving Sarah staring at her reflection in the maintenance office window. At 29, she was younger than most B-2 candidates by a decade. Her combat experience consisted of patrol flights over Syria that had involved more surveillance than engagement. She'd never dropped ordnance in anger, never pushed an aircraft beyond its design limits under enemy fire. The other pilots selected for elite programs had resumes thick with achievements that made headlines. Sarah's career had been marked by steady competence and an unfortunate tendency to question orders when something didn't feel right to her pilot's instincts. The flight to California gave her time to research what little public information existed about the B-2 program, $2 billion per aircraft. A wing design so radical that early test pilots had described flying it as trying to balance on a knife edge in a hurricane. Computer flight control so complex that the aircraft was technically unflyable without constant electronic intervention. Everything about the Spirit represented the pinnacle of technological aviation, where human intuition was supposed to be subordinate to digital precision. Edwards Air Force Base sprawled across the Mojave Desert like a monument to aviation ambition. The same airfield where Chuck Yeager had broken the sound barrier, where test pilots had pushed experimental aircraft beyond known limits, where careers were made and sometimes ended in smoking craters among the Joshua trees. Sarah's transport landed just after sunset, the desert air still shimmering with heat that would persist deep into the night. The base briefing officer, a captain named Rodriguez with the weary expression of someone who'd processed countless temporary assignments, handed Sarah a thick folder marked with classification stamps. "Welcome to the Black World, Captain Chen. Your quarters are in Building 1847. Orientation begins at 0500 tomorrow. I'd recommend getting sleep while you can, because the next few weeks are going to test everything you think you know about flying. Sarah's temporary quarters were Spartan but comfortable. A single room with a narrow bed, a desk, and a window that looked out over the flight line where various experimental aircraft sat under protective covers. She'd tried to call her parents that evening, but her phone showed no signal. The base operated under communication restrictions that effectively cut off contact with the outside world. Whatever happened at Edwards stayed at Edwards, at least until the Air Force decided otherwise. Sleep proved elusive. Sarah found herself replaying every moment of her flying career, searching for clues about why she'd been selected. Her academy. Instructors had noted her exceptional spatial awareness and her ability to maintain aircraft control in situations where other pilots relied too heavily on automation. But those same instructors had also written performance reviews that diplomatically suggested she might be better suited for transport aircraft than frontline fighters. They'd praised her caution while implying it was a liability in combat aviation. The next morning arrived with the harsh clarity of desert sunrise. Sarah reported to Building 2201 precisely at 0500, finding herself among 7 other pilots who shared the same expression of confused determination. The group represented a cross-section of Air Force aviation, fighter pilots with thousands of hours in F-22s and F-35s, transport specialists who'd flown C-17s into hostile airfields, even a former Navy pilot who'd transitioned to Air Force after carrier operations in the Pacific. What they all shared was a look of uncertainty about why they were there. Colonel Webb appeared at exactly 0500, his uniform bearing no unit patches or identifying marks beyond his rank insignia. He was a man who seemed to have been carved from the same granite as the surrounding mountains, his gray eyes taking in each pilot with the calculating assessment of someone who'd seen too many promising careers end in failure. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the most classified aviation program currently operating within the United States military. What you learn here, what you see here, and what you experience here will be compartmentalized under security classifications that will follow you for the rest of your lives. Some of you will succeed, most of you will not. Those who fail will return to your previous assignments with nothing more than a gap in your service records that you will never be permitted to explain. Webb gestured toward a massive hangar, visible through the briefing room windows, its doors sealed and heavily guarded. The B-2 Spirit represents 30 years of technological advancement in stealth technology, strategic bombing capabilities, and fly-by-wire control systems. It is not an aircraft that forgives mistakes, and it is not a platform that accommodates pilots who cannot adapt to its unique requirements. Captain Derek Mason, a fighter pilot from the 325th Fighter Wing, raised his hand. Sir, what specific requirements are we talking about? Most of us have experience with advanced fly-by-wire systems. Webb's expression suggested Mason had just asked the wrong question. Captain, the B-2's flight characteristics are unlike anything you've experienced. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The aircraft's stealth shaping requires wing designs that are inherently unstable. Without computer assistance, the Spirit would be unflyable by any human pilot. Your job will be to merge with those computer systems so completely that you become part of the aircraft's control loop. Pilots who fight the computers wash out. Pilots who trust them blindly also wash out. We need aviators who can achieve a balance between human intuition and digital precision that few people possess. Sarah felt a chill of recognition. The description matched exactly the kind of flying that had earned her criticism throughout her career. Her tendency to feel an aircraft's behavior through subtle vibrations and control responses. Her habit of making minute adjustments based on sensory input that didn't show up on instruments. Other pilots called it overthinking, but Webb seemed to be describing it as a requirement. The briefing continued with technical specifications that left most of the group taking furious notes. The B-2's wing loading, thrust-to-weight ratios, and operational parameters existed at the extreme edges of what physics allowed for sustained flight. Maximum gross weight of 336,500 pounds, spread across a wing area that created lift characteristics unlike any conventional aircraft. 4 General Electric F-118 engines buried deep within the wing structure to minimize infrared signature. A flight envelope that demanded respect for limits that could kill pilots who exceeded them by even small margins. Your training will consist of 3 phases, Webb continued. Ground school to familiarize you with systems and theory. Simulator training to develop the specific skills required for B-2 operations. And finally, if you survive the first 2 phases, actual flight training. In the aircraft itself, the attrition rate across all 3 phases is 73%. Major Lisa Hawkins, the former Navy pilot, asked the question they were all thinking. "Sir, what happens to those who complete the program?" For the first time, Webb smiled, though the expression held more warning than warmth. "Major, those who complete this program become part of an operational capability that doesn't officially exist. You'll fly missions that won't appear in any logbooks, carrying payloads to targets that will never be acknowledged. The B-2 Spirit is America's invisible sword, and its pilots are the hands that wield it." The morning's first classroom session introduced them to instructor Captain Patricia Valdez, a woman whose calm demeanor couldn't quite hide the predatory focus of someone who'd pushed aircraft beyond their documented limits. Valdez had been flying B-2 South for 8 years, according to the brief biography they'd been given. Though her actual experience was classified at levels, none of them possessed clearance to access. "The most important thing you need to understand about the Spirit," Valdez began, "is that it will try to kill you if you let it. The aircraft's stealth shaping creates aerodynamic characteristics that conventional training doesn't prepare you for. Wing-tip vortices that can flip the aircraft inverted in clear air turbulence. Control surface interactions that can induce oscillations faster than human reflexes can counter. Computer systems that can misinterpret pilot inputs in ways that create catastrophic control reversals." Sarah found herself taking notes not on the technical specifications, but on Valdez's body language and vocal emphasis. The instructor spoke about the B-2 with the kind of respect usually reserved for natural disasters or dangerous predators. This wasn't an aircraft that pilots mastered through conventional training methods. It was a machine that demanded a fundamentally different relationship between human and technology. "Your first assignment," Valdez continued, "is to memorize the Emergency Procedures Manual, all 847 pages. You have 48 hours. Tomorrow morning, you'll be tested on every procedure, and anyone scoring below 95% will be eliminated from the program." The manual they were given was thick enough to stop small arms fire. Sarah carried it back to her quarters, along with 3 additional technical publications covering systems integration, stealth technology principles, and flight envelope protection systems. The reading load was designed to identify candidates who could absorb and retain massive amounts of technical information under time pressure. That evening, Sarah discovered she wasn't alone in her quarters building. Captain Alex Rodriguez, a transport pilot from the 437th Airlift Wing, had the room next door and was struggling with the same mountain of technical material. 800 pages in 2 days, Rodriguez said, looking up from his manual as Sarah passed his open door. "They're trying to wash us out before we even see the aircraft." Sarah paused, considering whether to engage. Her academy experience had taught her that forming alliances too early could backfire if candidates were competing against each other rather than working toward common goals. "Maybe," she said carefully. Or maybe they're testing whether we can handle the information load required for actual operations. Rodriguez laughed, but the sound held little humor. Chen, right? I heard about your selection. Fighter pilot with no heavy aircraft experience. That's gotta be making you nervous. The comment stung because it was accurate. Sarah had spent the entire day feeling like an imposter among pilots whose qualifications obviously exceeded her own. Rodriguez had thousands of hours in multi-engine aircraft. Mason flew the most advanced fighter in the Air Force inventory. Major Hawkins had carrier landing experience that required skills Sarah had never developed. Everyone here is qualified, or we wouldn't have been selected, Sarah replied, more to convince herself than Rodriguez. Maybe, or maybe some of us, are here to fill quotas, and the Air Force is hoping we'll wash out early to save training resources. Sarah spent that night reading until her eyes burned, absorbing technical information about control surface authority, engine management systems, and radar cross-section optimization. The B-2 systems were integrated in ways that made changing one parameter affect dozens of others. Pilots needed to understand not just how to operate individual components, but how those components interacted under various flight conditions. The aircraft's most challenging characteristic was its fundamental instability. Unlike conventional aircraft that wanted to fly straight and level, the B-2's stealth shaping created a machine that constantly tried to depart controlled flight. The flight computers made thousands of control inputs per second to maintain stable flight, adjustments so rapid and complex that human pilots could never duplicate them manually. But humans were still required, because computers couldn't adapt to unexpected situations with the creativity that survival sometimes demanded. The ideal B-2 pilot needed to understand the aircraft systems well enough to work with the computers when they functioned correctly, and to override them intelligently when they didn't. Sarah found herself making margin notes that connected technical specifications to flying sensations she'd experienced in other aircraft. The way control surfaces felt when approaching aerodynamic limits, the subtle vibrations that preceded controlled departures, the sensory cues that indicated when an aircraft was operating outside its optimal performance envelope. Her instructors had always criticized this approach as unscientific, arguing that modern aviators should trust instruments over intuition. But reading about the B-2's flight characteristics, Sarah began to suspect that her supposedly outdated flying methods might actually be assets in an aircraft that demanded constant awareness of subtle performance changes. The next morning's examination was administered in a sterile classroom with individual computer terminals that prevented candidates from comparing answers. Sarah worked through 200 multiple-choice questions covering everything from emergency procedures to systems integration. Some questions required calculations based on weight and balance scenarios. Others demanded detailed knowledge of component specifications and operational limitations. The results were posted 2 hours later on a bulletin board outside the briefing room. Sarah's name appeared near the top with a score of 97.3%. Rodriguez had scored 94.1%, just below the elimination threshold. Mason's score was a perfect 100%, confirming his reputation as someone who excelled at standardized military training. But 2 names were missing from the list entirely. Captain Jennifer Walsh, an F-22 pilot from Langley Air Force Base, and Major David Thompson, a C-130 pilot with extensive special operations experience, had been eliminated without explanation. Their quarters were empty by noon, their personal effects removed, and their presence erased from the program as completely as if they'd never existed. "Welcome to Week 2, Captain Valdez announced to the remaining 6 candidates. "Today you begin simulator training. The B-2 simulator is the most advanced flight training device in the Air Force inventory. It will teach you to fly the aircraft, or it will prove that you cannot learn." The simulator building was adjacent to the classified hangar, connected by a covered walkway that prevented casual observation of personnel movements. Inside, Sarah discovered a training device that resembled something from science fiction more than conventional aviation. The simulator cockpit was an exact replica of the B-2's flight deck, complete with working displays, controls, and even environmental systems that reproduced the aircraft's unique acoustics. But the most impressive feature was the visual system. A spherical projection dome surrounded the cockpit, creating 360-degree imagery so realistic that Sarah's inner ear insisted she was actually flying. The computer systems could reproduce any weather condition, any geographical location, and any operational scenario that B-2 pilots might encounter. "Your first lesson," announced Chief Master Sergeant Kelly Morrison, the simulator's lead instructor, "is learning to taxi." The B-2's wing design creates ground handling characteristics that have destroyed aircraft when pilots made assumptions based on conventional training. Morrison was a 25-year veteran whose calm demeanor suggested she'd seen every possible way that overconfident pilots could embarrass themselves in expensive machinery. Her job was to teach candidates the fundamental skills required for B-2 operations, starting with basic aircraft handling and progressing through complex combat scenarios. Sarah strapped into the simulator's ejection seat, her hands automatically finding familiar controls while her eyes adapted to the B-2's unique cockpit layout. The aircraft's stealth requirements had dictated unusual placement of instruments and switches. Everything was designed to minimize radar reflectivity, even at the cost of pilot convenience. The simulated engine spooled up with a deep rumble that Sarah felt through the seat rather than heard through her headset. The B-2's buried engines produced thrust characteristics unlike any other aircraft, with power curves that required different throttle techniques than conventional jets. "Begin taxi," Morrison instructed through the intercom. "Follow the yellow line to runway 22 left." Sarah applied power carefully, feeling the simulator respond with the sluggish acceleration of a 336,000-pound aircraft. The B-2's wing design created ground effects that made steering unpredictable at low speeds. Too much rudder input could cause the aircraft to pivot sharply. Too little input could result in runway excursions that would damage the aircraft's delicate surfaces. Halfway to the runway, Sarah felt the simulator begin to veer left despite her efforts to maintain directional control. She applied more right rudder, but the aircraft continued drifting toward the taxiway edge. In a conventional aircraft, she would have increased power and used asymmetric thrust to regain control. But the B-2's buried engines made that technique ineffective. Instead, Sarah reduced power and applied brakes while making small rudder corrections. The aircraft straightened gradually, responding to inputs that felt counterintuitive compared to every other aircraft she'd flown. "Adequate," Morrison commented. "Chen, your instinct to reduce power was correct. The B-2's wing generates lift even at taxi speeds, and that lift reduces directional control authority. Most pilots try to power through control problems. That technique will put you in the dirt." The lesson continued with takeoff and landing practice, each evolution revealing new ways that the B-2 challenged conventional flying techniques. The aircraft's approach speeds were higher than most fighters, but its landing characteristics were more delicate than any transport. Too much sink rate could damage the wing structure. Too shallow an approach could result in runway overruns. That would be impossible to explain to congressional oversight committees. Sarah found herself relying on sensory cues that weren't programmed into the simulator's feedback systems. The way control surfaces felt when approaching aerodynamic limits. The subtle changes in engine noise that indicated power setting variations. The almost subliminal vibrations that preceded controlled departures. After 3 hours in the simulator, Sarah emerged feeling like she'd been flying for 8. The B-2's systems demanded constant attention to parameters that conventional aircraft managed automatically. Engine temperatures that required manual monitoring, control surface positions that needed continuous adjustment, fuel management procedures that involved calculations more complex than orbital mechanics. How'd it go? Rodriguez asked as they walked back to the briefing building. Like learning to fly all over again, Sarah admitted. Everything I thought I knew about aircraft handling was wrong. Tell me about it. I've been flying multi-engine aircraft for 10 years, and the B-2 makes a C-17 feel like a tricycle. The power settings, the approach speeds, the landing techniques, it's all different. That evening, Sarah reviewed her simulator performance on video recordings that captured every control input and aircraft response. The B-2's flight characteristics required techniques that contradicted much of her previous training. In fighters, aggressive control inputs were often necessary to achieve desired performance. In the B-2, aggressive inputs could induce oscillations that overwhelmed the flight computers and led to loss of control. The aircraft demanded a flying style that emphasized smoothness over speed, precision over power. Every control movement needed to be deliberate and measured. Every system's change required consideration of how it would affect other aircraft parameters. The B-2 was less a machine to be controlled than a partnership to be negotiated. Sarah's margin notes from that evening reflected her growing understanding of what the program was really testing. Technical knowledge was important, but the Air Force could teach systems information to any competent pilot. What they couldn't teach was the kind of intuitive aircraft handling that allowed pilots to feel their way through situations that weren't covered in technical manuals. The B-2 was an aircraft that would kill pilots who relied too heavily on either technology or instinct alone. Success required a balance between trusting the computers when they were correct and overriding them when human judgment suggested better alternatives. 3 weeks into the program, Sarah began to understand why her supposedly problematic flying characteristics had led to her selection. The B-2 needed pilots who could sense aircraft behavior through subtle cues that didn't show up on instruments. It needed aviators who questioned standard procedures when situations demanded creative solutions. But understanding her qualifications didn't make the training any easier. Each day brought new scenarios designed to test candidate reactions to systems failures, combat situations, and emergency procedures that pushed both aircraft and pilot to their operational limits. The attrition continued with merciless efficiency. Captain Rodriguez was eliminated after repeatedly failing to manage fuel distribution during long-range flight scenarios. His transport background had emphasized fuel efficiency over the complex balance requirements that kept the B-2's center of gravity within acceptable limits. Major Hawkins departed after a simulator session where her carrier landing experience led her to use approach techniques that worked perfectly for naval aviation, but created dangerous situations in the B-2. Her aggressive control inputs during a simulated emergency approach induced oscillations that would have destroyed the aircraft if the scenario had been real. By the end of the 4th week, only 3 candidates remained: Sarah, Captain Mason, and Major Christine Parker, a test pilot from Edwards who'd been flying experimental aircraft for 7 years. The program that had started with 8 highly qualified pilots had eliminated 5 through training scenarios that revealed the subtle incompatibilities between conventional aviation experience and B-2 requirements. "Congratulations, Captain," Valdez announced to the 3 survivors. "You've demonstrated the basic competencies required for B-2 operations. Now the real training begins." The real training, as it turned out, involved scenarios that pushed the simulator's capabilities to their limits. Combat missions over heavily defended targets where stealth alone wasn't sufficient protection. Systems failures that required improvised solutions not covered in technical manuals. Weather conditions that tested both aircraft performance and pilot decision-making. Sarah discovered that her supposed weaknesses were actually her greatest strengths in these advanced scenarios. Her tendency to overthink problems helped her find creative solutions when standard procedures weren't adequate. Her habit of feeling aircraft behavior through control responses allowed her to detect impending problems before they showed up on instruments. But Captain Mason was struggling. His textbook approach to flying worked perfectly in routine situations, but the B-2 regularly created non-routine situations that demanded adaptive thinking. His perfect scores on written examinations couldn't compensate for his inability to improvise when computers provided conflicting information or when mission requirements pushed the aircraft beyond documented performance limits. During a particularly challenging scenario involving a simulated systems failure over hostile territory, Mason's by-the-book approach led to a series of decisions that would have resulted in aircraft loss if the situation had been real. He'd followed emergency procedures perfectly, but those procedures were written for routine failures, not the cascade of problems that could occur during actual combat operations. "Mason," Valdez said after reviewing the simulation recordings, "your technical knowledge is excellent, but the B-2 requires pilots who can think beyond the checklist when situations demand creative solutions." 2 days later, Mason's name disappeared from the program roster, leaving only Sarah and Major Parker to continue toward actual flight training. The elimination wasn't announced or explained. Mason simply wasn't at the morning briefing, and his absence was never mentioned again. "Welcome to Phase 3, Colonel Webb announced to the 2 remaining candidates. "Tomorrow you begin flying the actual aircraft. Everything you've learned in simulators was preparation for this moment. The B-2 spirit doesn't forgive mistakes, and it doesn't provide second chances. You'll either prove you belong in this cockpit, or you'll prove that you don't." That evening, Sarah stood outside the classified hangar where the B-2 waited. Through gaps in the security barriers, she could see portions of the aircraft's angular surfaces, shapes so precisely engineered that they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. In 12 hours, she would either begin the most challenging phase of her flying career or join the long list of pilots who'd reached for something beyond their capabilities. The betting pool in the pilot's lounge had grown to $15,000, and the smart money was still against her. Sarah Chen, the fighter pilot with no heavy aircraft experience, the aviator whose career had been marked by steady competence rather than exceptional achievement. Tomorrow would determine whether her selection had been a mistake or whether the Air Force had identified something in her psychological profile that even she didn't fully understand. As she walked back to her quarters, Sarah reflected on the Fanlunwa journey that had brought her to this moment. Every criticism of her flying style, every performance review that suggested she overthought problems, every suggestion that she might be better suited for transport aircraft rather than fighters, all of it had been preparation for an aircraft that demanded exactly the kind of adaptive, intuitive flying that conventional training discouraged. The B-2 spirit was waiting, and Sarah Chen was finally ready to discover whether she possessed the rare combination of technical knowledge and adaptive instinct that the aircraft demanded from its pilots. The morning of Sarah's first B-2 flight arrived with the crystal clarity that only existed in the Mojave Desert before sunrise. She'd been awake since 0400, running through mental checklists and reviewing emergency procedures that she'd memorized weeks ago. Her flight suit felt different somehow, heavier with the weight of expectations and the knowledge that today would either validate her selection or confirm what many suspected about her qualifications. Major Christine Parker was already in the briefing room when Sarah arrived, studying weather reports with the methodical focus of someone who'd spent 7 years as a test pilot. Parker's credentials were intimidating, even by Edwards standards. She'd flown first flights in 3 experimental aircraft, survived 2 emergency ejections, and held a master's degree in aeronautical engineering from MIT. Her presence in the program made perfect sense to everyone who knew her background. Sarah's presence still felt like an administrative error that hadn't been corrected yet. "Morning, Chun," Parker said without looking up from her charts. "You ready for this?" The question carried layers of meaning that Sarah chose to ignore. As ready as anyone can be for something they've never done before. True enough. Though I have to say, your simulator scores have been impressive. Valdez mentioned that you're developing techniques that aren't in the manual. It was both a compliment and a subtle warning. In military aviation, techniques that weren't in the manual were often techniques that got pilots killed. Sarah had learned to be cautious about discussing her unorthodox approaches to aircraft handling, especially with someone whose test pilot background emphasized adherence to established procedures. Colonel Webb entered the briefing room precisely at 0530, followed by Captain Valdez and a flight instructor Sarah hadn't seen before. The new instructor was a woman in her early 40s whose calm demeanor couldn't quite mask the predatory alertness of someone who'd survived situations that had killed other pilots. "Ladies, meet Lieutenant Colonel Diana Foster," Webb announced. "Colonel Foster will be conducting your initial flight evaluations. She has more B-2 flight hours than any other pilot in the program, and her assessment will determine whether you continue to advance training or return to your previous assignments." Foster stepped forward, her eyes taking in both candidates. With the calculating assessment of someone who'd evaluated hundreds of pilots over the years. "Today's flights will test your ability to apply simulator training to actual aircraft operations. We'll start with basic aircraft handling and progress through increasingly complex scenarios. The B-2 will teach you things about flying that no simulator can replicate." The first surprise came during the walk to the aircraft. Sarah had expected to see the B-2 in its hangar, but instead they approached two aircraft sitting on the ramp in the early morning light. The sight of the actual bombers was breathtaking and intimidating in equal measure. Each aircraft represented $2 billion of technology shaped into surfaces, so angular and precise that they seemed to have been carved from single blocks of metal. "Parker, you'll fly aircraft 890128, Foster announced. "Chun, you're in 890132. We'll conduct separate evaluation flights to ensure independent assessment of your capabilities." Sarah approached her assigned aircraft with the reverence due to a machine that existed at the absolute pinnacle of aviation technology. The B-2's surfaces were covered with specialized coatings that absorbed radar energy, giving the aircraft a matte gray appearance that seemed to drink light rather than reflect it. Up close, she could see the precise tolerances required to maintain stealth characteristics. Panel gaps measured in fractions of inches, surface smoothness that exceeded the specifications of most laboratory instruments. The pre-flight inspection took longer than any aircraft Sarah had previously flown. Every surface required examination for damage that could compromise stealth characteristics. Every panel needed verification that it was properly secured. The B-2's operational requirements meant that even minor maintenance issues could abort. Missions that cost millions of dollars and involved strategic planning at the highest levels of government. Chief Master Sergeant Morrison supervised the pre-flight, pointing out inspection criteria that weren't covered in technical manuals. "Chun, see this panel edge here? Any gap wider than 2 millimeters can create radar returns that compromise the entire mission. The B-2 isn't just an aircraft, it's a precision instrument that requires aircraft maintenance standards." The cockpit entry process involved more security protocols than Sarah had encountered in any other aircraft. Biometric scanners verified her identity before allowing access to classified systems. Code words were required to activate certain displays. Even the aircraft startup procedures were classified at levels that required special clearances to access. Sarah settled into the pilot's seat, her hands automatically finding controls while her eyes adapted to the B-2's unique cockpit layout. Everything felt simultaneously familiar and alien. The basic flying instruments were arranged conventionally, but they were surrounded by displays and controls that existed nowhere else in aviation. Systems for managing stealth characteristics, monitoring radar signatures, controlling electronic warfare equipment that could deceive enemy defenses. "Starting engines," Foster announced through the intercom from the instructor's seat. Remember, the B-2's buried engines produced thrust characteristics unlike conventional aircraft. Power changes required different throttle techniques and longer response times. The first engine start was an education in patience. Unlike fighter aircraft that spooled up quickly, the B-2's engines took several minutes to reach idle power. Settings. The sound was unlike anything Sarah had experienced, a deep rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once rather than from identifiable engine locations. "Your aircraft, Chen," Foster said once all 4 engines were running. "Taxi to runway 22 left for departure." Sarah applied power carefully, feeling the aircraft begin to move with the ponderous acceleration of something that weighed as much as a small building. The B-2's ground handling characteristics were immediately apparent. The wing design created ground effects that made steering unpredictable at low speeds, requiring constant attention to maintain directional control. The taxi to the runway took 15 minutes, partly because of the aircraft's low-speed handling characteristics, and partly because of the security protocols that governed B-2 movements. Other aircraft were required to maintain specific distances from the bomber to prevent inadvertent observation of classified features. Ground personnel who weren't cleared for B-2 operations had to be moved away from taxiways before the aircraft could pass. "Tower, Stealth 01 ready for departure," Foster radioed as they reached the runway threshold. "Stealth 01, runway 22 left. Cleared for takeoff. Winds 240 at 12. Gust to 18. Sarah lined up on the runway centerline, her hands moving through the final checks with the precision that months of simulator training had ingrained. But this was different from simulation in ways that no computer could replicate. The aircraft's mass was evident in every control input. The engine's power was tangible through vibrations that traveled through the airframe. The reality of flying. $2 billion worth of classified technology created a psychological pressure that simulators couldn't duplicate. "Power up for takeoff," Foster instructed. "Remember, the B-2's wing loading requires higher rotation speeds than most aircraft. Don't try to pull it off the ground too early." Sarah advanced the throttles carefully, feeling the engines respond with thrust that pushed her back into her seat. The acceleration was impressive for such a massive aircraft, but it took longer to reach rotation speed than any fighter she'd flown. The runway markers passed with increasing frequency until Foster called rotate and Sarah pulled back on the controls. The B-2 lifted off with surprising grace for something so large and heavy. But as soon as they left the ground, Sarah understood why the aircraft had earned its reputation as a challenging machine to fly. The wing design that made it invisible to radar also made it inherently unstable in ways that conventional training hadn't prepared her for. "Positive rate, gear up," Foster announced. "Start your climb to 10,000 feet. Sarah retracted the landing gear and began a gentle climb, but immediately noticed that the aircraft required constant control inputs to maintain desired flight paths. Unlike conventional aircraft that would maintain stable flight with minimal pilot input, the B-2 wanted to wander in all 3 dimensions. The flight computers were making thousands of corrections per second, but they couldn't anticipate pilot intentions the way that human judgment could. "You're fighting the aircraft," Foster observed after several minutes of watching Sarah's control inputs. "The B-2 requires a different flying technique than anything else you've experienced. Think of it as a conversation with the computers rather than a battle for control." Sarah tried to relax her control inputs, allowing the aircraft systems to do more of the work while she focused on overall flight path management. The technique felt counterintuitive after years of flying aircraft that responded directly to control movements. The B-2's computers interpreted her inputs and translated them into the thousands of micro-adjustments required to maintain stable flight. "Better," Foster said. "Now let's try some basic air work." Turn left to heading 090 and climb to 15,000 feet. The turn revealed another aspect of the B-2's unique flight characteristics. The aircraft's response to control inputs was delayed by the time required for computers to process and implement pilot commands. In a fighter, Sarah could roll into a turn and immediately feel the aircraft respond. In the B-2, there was a noticeable lag between her control input and the aircraft's reaction. But as they leveled off at 15,000 feet, Sarah began to appreciate the aircraft's capabilities. Despite its size and weight, the B-2 was remarkably smooth in flight. The wing design that created control challenges also provided exceptional stability in turbulence. The ride quality was better than most transport aircraft, and the view from the cockpit was spectacular. "Let's try some approach and landing practice," Foster announced. "Contact Edwards approach and request vectors for the ILS runway 22 left." The approach phase introduced Sarah to another challenging aspect of B-2. Operations. The aircraft's approach speeds were higher than most fighters, but its landing characteristics required precision that exceeded anything she'd previously experienced. The wing design that provided exceptional cruise efficiency also created ground effects that could cause sudden lift variations during the final approach phase. Sarah configured the aircraft for landing, lowering gear and flaps while managing the complex systems that maintained stealth characteristics throughout the approach phase. The B-2's stealth requirements meant that certain antennas and sensors could only be extended during specific flight phases, requiring careful coordination between aircraft configuration and mission requirements. Stealth 01, Contact Tower 118.1. Approach control advised as they intercepted the instrument landing system. "Tower, Stealth 01, ILS 22 left," Foster radioed. "Stealth 01, runway 22 left, cleared to land. Winds 250 at 15, gusts to 22. The crosswind component was within limits, but challenging for an aircraft that was sensitive to wind conditions during landing. Sarah began the approach, trying to apply techniques she'd learned in simulators while adapting to the reality of flying an actual B-2 in real weather conditions. The approach felt stable until they descended through 500 feet above the ground. Suddenly, the aircraft encountered wind shear that caused airspeed fluctuations and altitude deviations that would have been manageable in a conventional aircraft. But the B-2's systems interpreted the turbulence as pilot-induced control inputs and began making corrections that actually worsened the situation. "I've got unusual control responses," Sarah announced, fighting to maintain approach parameters, as the aircraft's computers seemed to be working against her rather than with her. "Continue the approach," Foster instructed. "This is exactly the kind of situation where B-2 pilots earn their pay. Work with the computers, don't fight them." Sarah tried to reduce her control inputs, allowing the aircraft's systems to stabilize, while she focused on maintaining proper approach speed and glide path. But the technique felt wrong after years of flying aircraft where aggressive control inputs were often necessary to maintain desired performance. The situation deteriorated rapidly as they descended through 200 feet. The wind shear intensified, creating conditions that triggered multiple warnings from the aircraft systems. Sarah found herself fighting both the weather and the aircraft's computers, neither of which seemed willing to cooperate with her efforts to maintain a stable approach. "Go around," Foster commanded as they passed through 100 feet with approach parameters that were outside acceptable limits. Sarah applied power and began a climbing turn away from the runway, her heart rate elevated by the stress of an approach that had challenged every aspect of her flying skills. The go-around was executed smoothly, but the psychological impact of failing her first B-2 landing attempt was significant. "Don't let it get to you," Foster said as they climbed back to pattern altitude. The B-2 has humbled pilots with thousands of hours of heavy aircraft experience. Let's talk through what happened and try again. The debrief was educational, but not encouraging. Foster explained that Sarah's instinct to fight the aircraft's computers had created a feedback loop that made the approach unstable. The B-2 required a different mindset than conventional aircraft, one that emphasized cooperation with automated systems rather than direct pilot control. The aircraft's computers are designed to maintain stable flight, but they need consistent inputs from the pilot, Foster explained. When you fight the systems, they interpret your control movements as disturbances that need to be corrected. That creates oscillations that get worse rather than better. The second approach went better, partly because Sarah now understood the aircraft systems and partly because the wind conditions had improved. She was able to land successfully, though the touchdown was firmer than she would have liked, and the rollout required more attention to directional control than felt comfortable. After the flight, Sarah sat in the debriefing room reviewing her performance with Foster and Colonel Webb. The assessment was honest but not particularly encouraging. "Your basic flying skills are adequate," Foster began, "but your adaptation to B-2 systems needs significant improvement. The aircraft requires a different approach to pilot-aircraft interaction than conventional training provides." Webb consulted his notes before speaking. "Chen, your simulator performance suggested that you had developed an intuitive understanding of B-2 flight characteristics. Today's flight indicates that real aircraft operations are more challenging than simulator training can prepare you for." Sarah felt the familiar sensation of being evaluated and found lacking. Her flying career had been marked by performance reviews that praised her technical knowledge, while suggesting that her approach to aircraft handling was somehow inadequate for military aviation requirements. "Sir, I understand that today's performance wasn't up to program standards," Sarah said carefully. "But I believe I can adapt to the aircraft's requirements with additional training." Foster exchanged glances with Webb before responding. "Chen, adaptation isn't just about practice time. Some pilots possess the specific combination of skills required for B-2 operations, and others don't. Today's flight suggests that you may fall into the second category." The words stung because they echoed criticism Sarah had heard throughout her flying career. Too cautious for fighters, too aggressive for transports, too analytical for intuitive flying, too instinctive for systems-focused operations. She seemed to exist in the gaps between aircraft categories, never quite fitting the profiles that military aviation preferred. However, Webb continued, the program's policy is to provide each candidate with 3 evaluation flights before making final determinations. You'll have 2 more opportunities to demonstrate B-2 competency. That evening, Sarah found herself alone in her quarters, reviewing technical manuals and trying to understand what she'd done wrong during the day's flight. The B-2 systems were more complex than any aircraft she'd previously flown, but complexity alone didn't explain her difficulties with the approach and landing phases. Major Parker knocked on her door just after 2100, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who'd experienced similar challenges. "Heard about your approach issues," Parker said, settling into the room's single chair. "Foster mentioned that you had control feedback problems during the wind shear encounter." Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully. "I felt like I was fighting the aircraft instead of flying it. Every control input seemed to make things worse rather than better. That's the B-2 learning curve. The aircraft's computers are incredibly sophisticated, but they're also incredibly literal. They do exactly what they're programmed to do, whether that's what the situation actually requires or not." Parker's explanation helped clarify what had happened during the approach. Sarah's instinct to make aggressive control inputs during turbulence had triggered automatic responses from the aircrafts systems that created instability rather than correcting it. The B-2 required a counterintuitive approach where pilots sometimes had to accept short-term deviations in order to achieve long-term stability. How did your flight go? Sarah asked, though Parker's relaxed demeanor suggested it had gone better than her own. Better than yours, apparently, but not without challenges. Foster said my test pilot background helped with systems management, but I made some mistakes during emergency procedures that would have been problematic in actual combat situations. The conversation continued past midnight with both pilots, sharing insights about B-2 operations that weren't covered in technical manuals. Parker's test pilot experience provided perspectives on aircraft behavior that complemented Sarah's intuitive understanding of flight dynamics. Together, they began to develop approaches to B-2 flying that might prove more effective than conventional techniques. But Sarah's confidence had been shaken by the day's failures. She'd entered the program believing that her supposedly problematic flying characteristics might actually be assets in an unconventional aircraft. Today's flight had demonstrated that good intentions weren't sufficient substitutes for the specific skills that B-2 operations demanded. The second evaluation flight was scheduled for 3 days later, providing time for additional simulator training and technical study. Sarah spent those days immersed in B-2 systems, trying to understand not just how the aircraft's computers worked, but how they could be optimized to work with her flying style rather than against it. The breakthrough came during a late-night simulator session when Sarah was practicing approaches in various weather conditions. Instead of fighting the aircraft's tendency to make automated corrections, she began anticipating them and timing her control inputs to work with the computers rather than against them. The technique required a fundamental shift in flying philosophy. Instead of commanding the aircraft to perform specific maneuvers, Sarah learned to suggest desired outcomes and allow the computers to determine how to achieve them. It was less like flying a conventional aircraft and more like conducting an orchestra where each section contributed to an overall performance. Her second evaluation flight went significantly better than the first. Sarah was able to complete all required maneuvers within acceptable parameters, and her approach and landing were smooth despite challenging wind conditions. But Foster's debrief was still cautious. Improved performance, Chen, but I'm still seeing hesitation during critical phases of flight. The B-2 requires pilots who can make instantaneous decisions with incomplete information. Your analytical approach has merit, but it may be too slow for operational requirements. Sarah felt the familiar frustration of being criticized for thinking too much while simultaneously being expected to demonstrate superior judgment. Military aviation seemed to demand pilots who could make perfect decisions instantly, without the careful analysis that actually led to better outcomes. Webb's assessment was more encouraging but still qualified. Chun, your progress between flights indicates that you can adapt to B-2 requirements, but the pace of improvement needs to accelerate. Operational missions don't provide the luxury of extended learning curves. The third and final evaluation flight was scheduled for the following week, representing Sarah's last opportunity to demonstrate B-2 competency. Failure would mean return to her previous assignment, with no explanation of why she'd been absent from duty for 3 months. But success would mean entry into the most classified aviation program in the United States military, flying missions, that didn't officially exist to targets that were never acknowledged. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and Sarah's margin for error couldn't have been smaller. She spent the intervening week in intensive simulator training, working with Foster to refine techniques that optimized her flying style for B-2 operations. The sessions were demanding but productive, revealing approaches to aircraft handling that weren't covered in standard training curricula. Chun, Foster said after a particularly challenging simulator session, you're developing techniques that could actually improve our training methods. Your analytical approach to systems integration is yielding insights that more intuitive pilots miss. The comment was encouraging but also pressure-inducing. Sarah was beginning to understand that her supposedly problematic Characteristics might actually be exactly what the B-2 program needed, but only if she could demonstrate them consistently under evaluation conditions. The night before her final evaluation flight, Sarah lay awake reviewing every aspect of B-2 operations. Technical specifications, emergency procedures, systems integration requirements, operational limitations. She'd memorized information equivalent to several college courses, but academic knowledge wouldn't matter if she couldn't apply it effectively. In the aircraft, at 0300, she gave up on sleep and went to the base gym, running on treadmills until her mind was quiet enough to focus on the task ahead. In 6 hours, she would either prove that her selection for the program had been correct, or confirm that she was another pilot who'd reached beyond her capabilities. The pre-flight briefing for her final evaluation was more comprehensive than previous sessions, covering scenarios that would test every aspect of her B-2 competency. Emergency procedures, systems failures, combat situations, weather challenges. Foster would evaluate not just her flying skills, but her decision-making under pressure and her ability to adapt to unexpected situations. Today's flight will determine whether you advance to operational training, Foster announced as they walked to the aircraft. I'll be evaluating your performance against standards required for actual combat missions, not training tolerances. Sarah approached the B-2 with a combination of confidence and nervousness that felt familiar from other crucial moments in her flying career. She'd prepared as thoroughly as possible, but the aircraft would ultimately determine whether her preparation had been adequate. The pre-flight inspection was routine, but Sarah found herself paying attention to details that hadn't seemed important during previous flights. The precise tolerances required for stealth operations, the sophisticated systems that made the aircraft invisible to enemy radar, the complex integration requirements that allowed pilots to control such advanced technology. Engine start and taxi procedures went smoothly, reflecting the improved familiarity that came with experience. But as they reached the runway for takeoff, Sarah felt the weight of expectations that had been building throughout the program. This wasn't just another training flight. This was her final opportunity to prove that she belonged in the most elite aviation program in the military, flying the most advanced aircraft ever built. Everything she'd learned about the B-2, everything she'd discovered about her own capabilities, would be tested in the next 2 hours. "Your aircraft, Chen," Foster announced as they lined up for takeoff. "Show me what you've learned." Sarah advanced the throttles and felt the familiar surge of power that lifted the B-2 off the runway and into the morning sky. But this time, something was different. Instead of fighting the aircraft systems or trying to impose conventional flying techniques on an unconventional machine, she found herself working with the B-2 in ways that felt natural rather than forced. Aircraft seemed to respond to her intentions rather than just her control inputs. Turns were smoother, altitude changes more precise, systems management more intuitive. Sarah was beginning to understand what Foster meant about conversations with computers rather than battles for control. But the real test would come during the complex scenarios that Foster had planned for the evaluation. Emergency procedures under pressure, systems failures that required creative solutions, weather challenges that tested both aircraft performance and pilot judgment. As they climbed toward the first test area, Sarah felt a calm confidence that had been missing during her previous flights. She was no longer trying to prove that she could fly like other pilots. She was ready to prove that she could fly like herself, using the analytical approach and adaptive techniques that had always been her strengths rather than weaknesses. The B-2 was about to teach her whether that approach was sufficient for the demands of operational flying, or whether she would join the long list of pilots who'd been eliminated from the program despite their best efforts. The electronics warfare. Range stretched across 50 square miles of Nevada desert, a landscape so barren that it could have been mistaken for the surface of Mars. Sarah pressed her face against the B-2's side window, watching the geometric patterns of radar installations. and electronic countermeasures equipment that dotted the terrain below. This was where the Air Force tested its most classified systems against simulated enemy defenses, and where Sarah would either prove her worth or wash out of the program in spectacular fashion. Her final evaluation flight had concluded 3 days ago with results that surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of the marginal performance that had characterized her earlier flights, Sarah had demonstrated a level of systems integration and aircraft handling that exceeded Foster's expectations. More importantly, she developed techniques for optimizing B-2 performance that weren't documented in any technical manual. "Chen," Foster had said during the post-flight debrief, "your approach to aircraft systems management is unconventional, but it's yielding results that suggest you understand something about the B-2 that other pilots are missing." The comment had been qualified praise at best, but it represented a fundamental shift in how the program evaluated her capabilities. For the first time since arriving at Edwards, Sarah felt like her analytical approach to flying was being recognized as an asset rather than criticized as a liability. Major Parker had also passed her evaluation flights, though her path through the program had been more conventional. Her test pilot background and engineering education had prepared her well for B-2 operations, and her performance had been consistently competent throughout the training phases. But competent wasn't enough for the mission they'd been briefed on that morning. Colonel Webb stood at the front of the secure briefing room, his expression grim as he outlined a scenario that would test both pilots beyond anything they'd experienced. During training, the mission profile involved penetrating a heavily defended target area using electronic warfare techniques that pushed the B-2 stealth capabilities to their absolute limits. "Ladies, this exercise represents the most challenging scenario our aircraft might face in actual combat," Webb began. "You'll be flying against radar systems and electronic countermeasures that simulate the most advanced threats our intelligence community has identified. Failure to complete the mission objectives will result in immediate elimination from the program." The briefing materials were classified at levels that required special clearances just to handle. Sarah studied reconnaissance photographs of the target area, noting the dense concentration of surface-to-air missile sites and radar installations that would make the mission extremely hazardous for any conventional aircraft. "Your ingress route will take you through a radar coverage area that normally would be considered impenetrable," Foster explained, pointing to a map that showed overlapping detection zones in red. "The B-2 stealth characteristics should provide sufficient protection, but only if you maintain precise flight profiles and execute electronic warfare procedures flawlessly." The mission parameters were unforgiving. Any deviation from planned altitudes could expose the aircraft to radar detection. Any failure to execute countermeasures procedures could result in simulated missile engagement. Any systems malfunction could compromise stealth characteristics and lead to mission failure. Sarah felt the familiar tension that preceded challenging flights, but this time it was tempered by confidence gained through recent successes. Her understanding of B-2 systems had evolved from academic knowledge to intuitive comprehension that allowed her to anticipate aircraft behavior and optimize performance in ways that technical manuals couldn't teach. "Chen, you'll be primary for this mission," Webb announced, catching Sarah off guard. "Parker will fly backup in the second aircraft, but mission success depends on your ability to penetrate the target area and deliver simulated ordnance within acceptable parameters." The decision to make Sarah primary pilot was unexpected and significant. Throughout the program, Parker's superior credentials and conventional competence had made her the obvious choice for leadership roles. Selecting Sarah suggested that the program staff had identified capabilities that weren't immediately apparent from her background or early performance. "Sir, why am I primary?" Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Webb exchanged glances with Foster before responding. "Chen, Your recent flights have demonstrated an understanding of B-2 systems integration that could prove crucial for this type of mission. Your analytical approach to aircraft performance optimization has yielded techniques that might make the difference between mission success and failure. The explanation was encouraging but also pressure-inducing. Sarah was being selected not despite her unconventional approach to flying, but because of it. The program needed pilots who could push the B-2 beyond documented performance limits while maintaining the precision required for stealth operations. Preparation for the mission consumed the next week. Sarah immersed herself in electronic warfare theory, studying the principles behind radar stealth and the techniques required to maintain invisibility while operating in hostile environments. The B-2's stealth characteristics weren't magical properties that automatically protected the aircraft. They required constant management by pilots who understood how to optimize flight profiles for minimal radar signature. The key insight came during a late-night study session when Sarah was reviewing radar cross-section data for various flight attitudes. She noticed that the B-2's stealth effectiveness varied significantly with minor changes in pitch and bank angles. Conventional flying techniques that prioritized passenger comfort or fuel efficiency could actually compromise stealth characteristics in ways that made the aircraft detectable to sophisticated radar systems. Her discovery led to conversations with the program's stealth technology specialists, engineers who'd spent years developing the theoretical foundations for radar-absorbing aircraft design. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, the lead engineer, was initially skeptical of suggestions from a pilot who'd been in the program for less than 6 months. Captain Chen, the B-2's stealth characteristics were optimized through decades of research and testing. Rodriguez explained with the patience usually reserved for explaining complex concepts to children. The flight profiles you're suggesting would require constant attitude adjustments that pilots couldn't maintain with sufficient precision. But Sarah's simulator tests suggested otherwise. Using techniques she'd developed for optimizing aircraft performance, she demonstrated flight profiles that maintained stealth effectiveness while providing better fuel economy and reduced flight time. The key was anticipating radar illumination patterns and adjusting aircraft attitude to minimize reflective surfaces. Dr. Rodriguez, the simulator data shows that these techniques could reduce radar signature by 12% while improving mission efficiency, Sarah said, pointing to performance graphs that documented her findings. The attitude changes are small enough that properly trained pilots could maintain them consistently. Rodriguez studied the data with growing interest. These results suggest that pilot technique could be more important for stealth operations than we've previously understood. If your findings are correct, they could revolutionize how we employ B-2 South in contested environments. The conversation attracted attention from other program personnel, including Colonel Webb and Lieutenant Colonel Foster. Sarah found herself presenting her stealth optimization techniques to audiences that included some of the Air Force's most senior aviation experts. Chen, Webb said after reviewing her analysis, your work suggests that conventional pilot training may not be adequate for optimal B-2 employment. We may need to completely revise our approach to stealth flying techniques. The recognition was gratifying but also overwhelming. Sarah had spent her entire career being criticized for overthinking problems that other pilots solved through standardized procedures. Now she was being praised for exactly the kind of analytical approach that had previously been considered problematic. But the real test would come during the actual mission, where theoretical understanding would have to be translated into practical performance under conditions that simulated actual combat operations. Mission day arrived with the crystal clear weather that made the Nevada desert ideal for flight testing. Sarah completed her pre-flight inspection with the meticulous attention to detail that B-2 operations demanded, paying special attention to systems that would be crucial for stealth operations. The aircraft assigned for the mission was 890127, one of the program's newest bombers equipped with the latest electronic warfare systems. Sarah had flown this particular aircraft twice before, and she'd developed an understanding of its specific performance characteristics that would prove crucial for the demanding mission profile. Pre-start checklist complete, Foster announced from the instructor's seat. Remember, this mission will be evaluated not just on whether you reach the target, but on how efficiently you employ stealth techniques to get there. Sarah started the engines with the precision that had become second nature after weeks of B-2 operations, but her mind was focused on the challenging hours ahead. The mission profile would take them through radar coverage areas that would detect any conventional aircraft within seconds. Only the B-2's stealth characteristics and her ability to optimize them would provide sufficient protection to complete the mission. The taxi to the runway was routine, but Sarah found herself reviewing the flight plan one final time. The ingress route was carefully calculated to exploit gaps in radar coverage, while minimizing exposure to the most dangerous threats. But calculations based on theoretical performance wouldn't matter if she couldn't execute the required flight profiles with sufficient precision. Tower, Stealth 03, ready for departure, Foster radioed as they reached the runway threshold. Stealth 03, runway 04 right, cleared for takeoff. Contact departure control 124. 3. Sarah aligned the aircraft on the runway centerline and advanced the throttles, feeling the familiar surge of power that lifted the B-2 into the morning sky. But this takeoff was different from training flights, because it marked the beginning of a mission that would determine whether her unconventional approach to flying had any value in operational situations. The climb to cruise altitude was uneventful, providing time to configure the aircraft systems for stealth operations. Sarah activated electronic warfare equipment that would monitor radar threats and automatically deploy countermeasures if hostile illumination was detected. The systems were so sophisticated that they could identify specific radar types and tailor responses to maximize effectiveness against particular threats. Approaching the first radar coverage area, Foster announced as they neared the electronic warfare range. Execute stealth protocols and begin evasive maneuvers. Sarah initiated the flight profile she developed during weeks of analysis and simulator testing. Instead of maintaining conventional straight and level flight, she began making subtle attitude adjustments that optimized the aircraft's radar cross-section for minimal detectability. The changes were small enough that passengers wouldn't notice them, but sophisticated enough that they could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The first radar site appeared on their threat display as they entered the engagement area. Sarah watched the symbology indicate hostile illumination, while she adjusted the aircraft's flight path to minimize reflective surfaces. The B-2's stealth characteristics were working as designed, but she could optimize them further through precise control of aircraft attitude and flight path. Threat radar active, bearing 030, range 15 miles, Foster reported. No indication of detection. Sarah continued her optimized flight profile, making adjustments so subtle that they were barely perceptible, but significant enough to reduce radar signature below detection thresholds. The technique required constant attention to aircraft attitude and continuous monitoring of threat displays, but the results were immediately apparent on their stealth monitoring equipment. Chun, our radar cross-section is 12% lower than programmed mission parameters, Foster observed with surprise. Whatever you're doing is working better than expected. The validation was encouraging, but Sarah knew the real challenges were ahead. The first radar site was relatively simple compared to the integrated air defense system they would encounter deeper in the target area. Multiple radar types operating simultaneously could create detection opportunities that single threats couldn't exploit. 20 minutes into the mission, they encountered the scenario that had eliminated other pilots from similar exercises. A surface-to-air missile site activated its target acquisition, radar just as they were passing through a coverage area where two other radar systems were operating. The combination created overlapping detection, zones that would challenge even the B-2's advanced stealth capabilities. "Multiple threats active," Foster announced, her voice carrying the tension that came with realistic combat simulations. SAM site bearing 090, acquisition radar active. Search radars bearing 045 and 135, both tracking. Sarah found herself managing more variables than any training scenario had required. Aircraft attitude had to be optimized for 3 different radar frequencies simultaneously. Flight path had to minimize exposure time while maintaining course toward the target. Electronic warfare systems needed coordination to avoid mutual interference, while providing maximum protection against detection. This was the moment when conventional training procedures would have called for predetermined responses that couldn't account for the specific combination of threats they were facing. But Sarah's analytical approach allowed her to evaluate the situation dynamically and develop solutions that weren't covered in any manual. Adjusting flight profile for optimal stealth against multiple illumination sources, Sarah announced, beginning a series of attitude changes that would have seemed random to observers but were actually calculated to minimize radar signature against the specific threats they were facing. The technique worked. Their aircraft remained undetected while passing through radar coverage areas that should have exposed them to multiple tracking systems. Sarah's ability to optimize stealth characteristics in real time was proving more effective than standard procedures that assumed average threat environments. "Impressive flying, Chen," Foster said as they cleared the multiple threat area. "Your stealth optimization is exceeding all mission parameters. How are you calculating those attitude adjustments?" Sarah tried to explain the intuitive process that allowed her to feel how the aircraft's surfaces were oriented relative to radar illumination sources. It wasn't something she'd learned from technical manuals, but rather an understanding that had developed through weeks of studying radar, cross-section data, and correlating it with aircraft behavior. "I'm monitoring how control surface positions affect radar reflectivity and adjusting flight attitude to minimize returns from the most dangerous threats," Sarah explained. "The key is anticipating radar illumination patterns and positioning the aircraft to present the smallest possible signature." The explanation sounded simpler than the reality of managing dozens of variables simultaneously while maintaining precise flight paths through hostile airspace. But Sarah had discovered that her analytical approach to flying could be applied to stealth operations in ways that yielded performance improvements no one had previously achieved. The mission continued through increasingly challenging scenarios as they approached the simulated target area. Each radar site required different optimization techniques. Each threat system demanded specific countermeasures. The workload was intense, but Sarah found herself managing complexity that would have overwhelmed her during early training flights. "Target area in sight," Foster announced as they approached the final objective. "Begin attack profile and weapons delivery simulation." The target itself was defended by the most sophisticated radar systems the electronic warfare range could deploy. Multiple tracking radars operating on different frequencies, surface-to-air missile sites with overlapping coverage areas, and electronic jamming systems designed to disrupt aircraft navigation and communication equipment. Sarah initiated the attack profile she'd planned during mission preparation, diving toward the target at angles and speeds calculated to minimize exposure time while maintaining stealth characteristics. The maneuver required precise control of aircraft energy and attitude while managing electronic warfare systems that were operating at maximum capability. "Weapon release in 30 seconds, Foster announced. "Maintain current flight profile." Sarah held the aircraft steady, despite turbulence and electronic interference that threatened to disrupt both navigation and stealth systems. The target was clearly visible through the aircraft's advanced optical systems, and the attack solution was well within acceptable parameters. "Weapon away," Foster called as they simulated ordnance release. Direct hit on primary target. Begin egress immediately. The egress phase presented different challenges as they climbed away from the target area while enemy radar systems attempted to track their departure. Sarah's stealth optimization techniques were even more crucial during this phase because the aircraft's climbing flight path presented different surface angles to illuminating radars. But her understanding of radar cross-section principles allowed her to maintain invisibility even during the complex maneuvering required to clear the target area. The aircraft remained undetected throughout the egress, demonstrating stealth capabilities that exceeded mission planning assumptions. Outstanding mission execution, Foster said as they cleared the final threat area and began the flight back to Edwards. Your stealth optimization techniques achieved results that I've never seen before in actual mission profiles. The flight back to base provided time to review mission data and analyze the effectiveness of Sarah's unconventional approaches to B-2 operations. The aircraft's computers had recorded every aspect of their performance, generating data that would be studied by stealth technology experts and mission planners throughout the Air Force. Chen, your radar cross-section management reduced our detectability by an average of 15% throughout the mission, Foster reported, reviewing the preliminary data. More importantly, you maintained those improvements while executing complex attack profiles that usually degrade stealth performance. The mission results were better than anyone had expected, but Sarah knew that success in one exercise didn't guarantee acceptance into operational B-2 squadrons. The program would evaluate not just her performance, but her ability to teach stealth optimization techniques to other pilots and to develop procedures that could be standardized across the entire B-2 fleet. Landing at Edwards felt different from previous flights because Sarah knew she'd proven something important about her capabilities and about approaches to B-2 operations that hadn't been fully explored. Her analytical flying style had yielded practical benefits that couldn't be achieved through conventional training methods. The post-mission debrief lasted 4 hours and included personnel from throughout the B-2 program hierarchy. Colonel Webb, Dr. Rodriguez, Foster, and several specialists whose job titles were classified at levels Sarah didn't possess clearance to know. They reviewed every aspect of the mission, analyzing techniques and procedures that might revolutionize how the Air Force employed its most advanced aircraft. Captain Chen, Webb began, your mission performance has implications that extend far beyond this training program. Your stealth optimization techniques could change how we conduct strategic bombing operations in contested environments. The recognition was gratifying, but Sarah understood that it also came with responsibilities. If her techniques were adopted by operational squadrons, she would be expected to help develop training programs and standardize procedures that other pilots could learn and apply. Sir, I'm honored by the confidence, but I should point out that these techniques require level of systems understanding that might not be compatible with conventional pilot training methods, Sarah said carefully. Webb nodded thoughtfully. That's exactly what we need to discuss. Your approach to B-2 operations suggests that our entire training philosophy may need revision. We may need pilots who think more like engineers and engineers who understand pilot requirements better. The conversation continued long after the formal debrief had ended, with Sarah finding herself at the center of discussions about fundamental changes to Air Force training and operational procedures. Her supposedly problematic analytical approach was being recognized as exactly the kind of thinking the service needed for its most advanced aircraft. But the real validation came 3 days later when Sarah received orders that would change the entire trajectory of her military career. Instead of returning to her previous assignment or being eliminated from the program, she was being assigned to a position that didn't officially exist within the Air Force organizational structure. Congratulations, Captain Chen, Colonel Webb said as he handed her the classified orders. You're being assigned to the B-2 Advanced Development Program. Your job will be to develop and test techniques that push the aircraft beyond its documented performance limits. The assignment was everything Sarah had worked toward without knowing. It was possible. She would be flying the most advanced aircraft in the world while helping to develop capabilities that could determine the outcome of future conflicts. Her analytical approach to flying was no longer a liability to be managed, but an asset to be exploited for national security purposes. But success in the development program would require her to work with classified technologies and operational requirements that made her previous training seem elementary by comparison. She would be testing aircraft modifications and mission profiles that pushed both human and machine capabilities to their absolute limits. Major Parker received similar orders, though her assignment focused on conventional mission planning and tactics development. Both pilots would be working on different aspects of the same ultimate goal, advancing B-2 capabilities to maintain American strategic superiority in an increasingly dangerous world. As Sarah cleaned out her temporary quarters at Edwards, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. Every criticism of her flying style, every suggestion that she overthought problems, every performance review that questioned her suitability for military aviation had been preparation for an assignment that required exactly the kind of analytical thinking that conventional training discouraged. The B-2 program had taught her that being different wasn't necessarily a weakness. Sometimes the qualities that made pilots unsuitable for conventional aircraft were exactly the qualities that advanced aircraft required. The key was finding the right match between human capabilities and machine requirements. Her phone rang as she was packing the last of her technical manuals. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the voice was unmistakably that of Dr. Rodriguez. Captain Chen, I wanted to personally congratulate you on your assignment to the Advanced Development Program. Your work on stealth optimization has already influenced modifications to our next-generation aircraft designs. The call was unexpected but gratifying. Sarah had never imagined that her flying techniques could influence aircraft design, but the B-2 program had taught her that the relationship between pilots and technology was more complex than conventional training suggested. Dr. Rodriguez, I'm honored that my work has been useful. I look forward to continuing the collaboration between pilots and engineers. That collaboration will be crucial for future aircraft development. We're designing systems that will require pilots who can think like engineers and engineers who understand pilot requirements. Your background suggests you might be ideal for bridging that gap. As Sarah hung up the phone, she realized that her career was entering the phase that she couldn't have imagined when she'd first arrived at Edwards. Instead of being eliminated for failing to fit conventional pilot profiles, she was being selected for assignments that required exactly the kind of unconventional thinking that had always characterized her approach to flying. The B-2 program had been more than pilot training. It had been a process of discovering that the qualities she'd always considered weaknesses were actually her greatest strengths, and that the Air Force needed pilots who could think beyond the limitations of conventional training and operational procedures. Tomorrow she would begin working with technologies and mission requirements that would make her previous challenges seem routine by comparison. But Sarah Chen was finally ready to prove that sometimes the pilots who don't fit traditional molds are exactly the pilots that advanced aircraft need to reach their full potential. The emergency klaxon echoed through the Nevada mountains at 0347 hours. Jolting Sarah from restless sleep in her quarters at the classified facility. Red lights strobed in the hallway as she pulled on her flight suit, muscle memory guiding her through procedures drilled into every pilot who'd ever scrambled for an urgent mission. But this wasn't a drill, and the aircraft waiting in the hangar wasn't a training simulator. General Patricia Hawthorne, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was missing somewhere over the Panamint Range in a disabled VIP transport, the Storm. System that had moved in during the night had grounded all conventional search and rescue aircraft, creating weather conditions that would challenge even the most experienced pilots. Radar had lost the general's aircraft 2 hours ago, and time was running out. Colonel Webb met Sarah at the operations center, his face grim in the harsh fluorescent lighting. "Chen, we need the B-2 airborne in 20 minutes. The general's aircraft went down in terrain that's impossible to reach by ground, and the weather has every other aircraft grounded." Sarah studied the weather displays showing wind shear, mountain wave turbulence, and cloud layers that extended from ground level to 30,000 feet. The conditions were beyond the operating limits of helicopters, fighters, or transport aircraft. Only the B-2's unique flight characteristics might allow penetration of the storm system, but even that would require flying the aircraft at the absolute edge of its performance envelope. "Sir, the weather conditions are outside normal. B-2 operating parameters," Sarah said, pointing to wind velocity readings that exceeded structural limits. "Are we authorized to exceed design limitations?" Webb's expression left no doubt about the mission's importance. General Hawthorne was returning from a classified meeting that could affect national security decisions. "We need her found and extracted, regardless of weather conditions or aircraft limitations." The briefing was compressed into 15 minutes, covering terrain features, weather patterns, and emergency procedures that might be required during a search mission, unlike anything the B-2 had previously attempted. Sarah would be flying alone, without an instructor pilot, in conditions that would test both her skills and the aircraft's capabilities beyond documented limits. The walk to the hangar felt different from training flights because the stakes were measured in human lives rather than program completion scores. Sarah completed her pre-flight inspection with extra attention to systems that would be crucial for low-altitude operations in severe weather, knowing that equipment failures could prove fatal for both herself and the missing general. The B-2, set under harsh work lights, its angular surfaces seeming to absorb illumination while ground crews completed final preparations. Chief Master Sergeant Morrison supervised fuel loading and systems checks with the urgency that came with actual emergencies rather than training exercises. "Aircraft's ready, Captain," Morrison announced as Sarah approached the boarding ladder. "All systems nominal, but remember that the weather you're flying into would ground every other aircraft on this base." Sarah settled into the cockpit, her hands moving through startup procedures with the precision that months of training had ingrained. But this time, every switch position and system parameter carried weight that training flights couldn't duplicate. Lives depended on her ability to push the B-2 beyond its documented capabilities, while maintaining the safety margins that would allow mission completion. Engine start proceeded normally, despite crosswinds that rocked the massive aircraft on its landing gear. Sarah monitored systems displays that showed weather conditions deteriorating by the minute, knowing that delay would only make the mission more dangerous for everyone involved. "Tower, Stealth 07, ready for immediate departure. Search and rescue mission," Sarah radioed as she completed final checks. "Stealth 07, runway 22 left, cleared for takeoff. Winds 280 at 35, gusts to 52. Weather conditions are beyond normal aircraft limitations." Sarah aligned the aircraft with the runway centerline and advanced throttles to maximum power, feeling the B-2 accelerate through crosswinds that would have prevented takeoff in smaller aircraft. The rotation speed was higher than normal due to wind conditions, but the aircraft lifted off smoothly and began climbing into the storm system that had grounded every other aircraft. The turbulence was immediate and severe, testing both Sarah's flying skills and the aircraft's structural limits. Mountain wave conditions created vertical air currents that threw the massive bomber around like a toy, requiring constant control inputs to maintain anything resembling controlled flight. "Stealth 07, contact search and rescue frequency 243.0, Tower advised. Good luck." Sarah switched to the emergency frequency, and immediately heard the controlled chaos of a major search operation. Helicopter crews reporting weather conditions that prevented flight, ground teams unable to reach the crash area due to terrain, and rescue coordinators trying to coordinate resources that were inadequate for the mission requirements. Search Control, Stealth 07 airborne and proceeding to search area, Sarah announced. Request coordinates for last known position. Stealth 07, last radar contact was grid 347,892, altitude approximately 8,500 feet. Be advised that terrain in that area reaches 11,000 feet with box canyons that could create severe turbulence. Sarah programmed the coordinates into her navigation system while fighting turbulence that made precise control inputs nearly impossible. The B-2 systems were working at maximum capacity to maintain stable flight, and she could feel the aircraft being pushed toward its operational limits by weather conditions that conventional aircraft couldn't survive. The search area was 60 miles northeast, requiring flight through mountain terrain that funneled winds into patterns that created some of the most dangerous flying conditions in North America. Sarah descended through cloud layers thick enough to block all visual references, relying entirely on instruments while the aircraft bucked through air currents that tested its structural limits. Stealth 07, be advised that Air Force rescue helicopters attempted penetration of the search area and were forced to abort due to severe turbulence. Search Control reported, "You're our only asset capable of reaching the crash site." The pressure was enormous, but Sarah found herself drawing on techniques she'd developed during B-2 training that went beyond standard operating procedures. Her analytical approach to aircraft handling allowed her to anticipate turbulence patterns and adjust flight controls to minimize structural stress while maintaining course toward the search coordinates. 20 minutes into the flight, she encountered the most severe conditions yet. Wind shear that would have torn apart smaller aircraft, downdrafts that pushed the B-2 toward terrain, and turbulence so violent that her vision blurred despite the aircraft's sophisticated stability systems. This was the moment when conventional procedures would have called for mission abort. But Sarah understood that General Hawthorne's survival might depend on capabilities that existed beyond documented aircraft limitations. She began using flight techniques that pushed the B-2 into performance regimes that no training manual had ever explored. The key insight came when she realized that the aircraft's stealth shaping, designed to deflect radar energy, could also be used to manage airflow in ways that reduced turbulence effects. By carefully controlling aircraft attitude and flight path, she could position the B-2's unique surfaces to minimize the impact of severe weather conditions. The technique worked. Instead of fighting the turbulence, Sarah began working with it, using the aircraft's unconventional aerodynamics to find stable air in conditions that would have destroyed conventional aircraft. Her understanding of how the B-2 systems integrated allowed her to optimize performance in ways that no other pilot had attempted. Search Control Stealth 07 has reached the search area and beginning visual reconnaissance, Sarah reported as she broke through the cloud layer at 9,000 feet. The terrain below was a nightmare of razor-sharp ridges and box canyons that created their own weather patterns. Sarah could see why helicopters had been unable to penetrate the area, and why ground rescue teams couldn't reach the crash site. The mountains formed a natural fortress that protected the interior valleys from everything except aircraft capable of flying in impossible conditions. But the B-2's capabilities, combined with Sarah's adaptive flying techniques, allowed her to descend into canyons that no other aircraft could survive. She began a systematic search pattern, flying at altitudes and speeds that pushed both her skills and the aircraft's performance beyond anything attempted in training. The wreckage appeared suddenly in a narrow valley that was invisible from higher altitudes. The VIP transport had impacted on a small plateau surrounded by peaks that rose another 1,000 feet on all sides. creating a natural bowl that trapped weather patterns and made rescue impossible by conventional means. Search Control, Stealth 07 has located the crash site, Sarah reported, circling the wreckage while evaluating rescue possibilities. Aircraft is severely damaged, but I can see movement near the fuselage. The survival of anyone from the crash was miraculous given the terrain and impact forces, but rescue presented challenges that went beyond anything Sarah had imagined. The crash site was surrounded by terrain that made helicopter access impossible and weather conditions prevented. Parachute operations that might have allowed rescue teams to reach the survivors. Stealth 07, what are the possibilities for aircraft recovery of survivors? Search Control asked. Sarah studied the terrain while maintaining the precise flight path required to avoid collision with surrounding peaks. The valley was narrow, enough that the B-2's wingspan barely fit between the walls, and the elevation created density-altitude conditions that reduced aircraft performance significantly. Search Control, I'm going to attempt something that's never been tried with a quad. B-2, Sarah announced, making a decision that would either save lives or end her own. I'm going to try an inverted approach through the canyon at high speed to create enough lift for survivor recovery. The maneuver she was contemplating was beyond anything covered in training or technical manuals. Flying the B-2 inverted through a narrow canyon at near supersonic speeds would create aerodynamic forces that might allow the aircraft to generate enough lift to maintain altitude while dropping emergency supplies and rescue equipment. Stealth 07, that maneuver is not authorized, came the immediate response. Abort rescue attempt and return to base. But Sarah could see figures moving near the wreckage, and she knew that conventional rescue methods would take days to organize under current weather conditions. General Hawthorne and her crew would not survive that long in the harsh mountain environment. Search Control, I'm declaring an emergency and executing immediate rescue operations, Sarah announced, positioning the aircraft for an approach that would either demonstrate the B-2's ultimate capabilities or prove that some missions were beyond even its remarkable performance. The inverted approach required flying techniques that combined everything Sarah had learned about the aircraft's unique characteristics with adaptive skills that went beyond any training she'd received. She rolled the B-2 inverted and began a high-speed descent through the canyon, using the aircraft's stealth surfaces to manage airflow in ways that created lift despite the unconventional attitude. The maneuver worked perfectly. Flying inverted at Mach 0.95, Sarah threaded the massive bomber through terrain that left less than 50 feet of clearance on each wingtip, while using the aircraft's unique aerodynamics to maintain precisely controlled flight that allowed accurate delivery of emergency supplies to the crash survivors. Search Control, survivor recovery supplies delivered accurately, Sarah reported as she pulled out of the canyon in a climbing turn that stressed the aircraft to its structural limits. General Hawthorne is alive and rescue teams now have equipment to sustain survivors until ground extraction is possible. The flight back to Edwards was routine compared to the canyon approach, but Sarah understood that she'd just demonstrated capabilities that would revolutionize how the Air Force employed its most advanced aircraft. The B-2 wasn't just a strategic bomber, it was a platform capable of missions that no other aircraft could attempt. The landing was smooth despite crosswinds that still exceeded normal limitations, and Sarah found herself surrounded by personnel whose expressions ranged from amazement to disbelief. Colonel Webb approached the aircraft as she completed shutdown procedures, his face showing relief and pride in equal measure. Chen, what you just accomplished was either the finest display of pilot skill in Air Force history or the most dangerous stunt ever attempted with a strategic bomber, Webb said as she climbed down from the cockpit. 3 hours later, word came that ground rescue teams had reached General Hawthorne and her crew, all of whom had survived thanks to the emergency supplies Sarah had delivered during her impossible canyon approach. The general's first message upon rescue was a request to personally thank the pilot who'd saved their lives. The mission had proven that Sarah's analytical approach to flying, combined with her understanding of B-2 systems, could push the aircraft beyond its documented limitations to accomplish missions that conventional thinking considered impossible. She'd finally found the perfect match between her supposedly problematic characteristics and aircraft that required exactly those qualities to reach their full potential. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.